All right, so Joe, on Friday, Senators Chuck Grassley and Ron Johnson disclosed 4 redacted footnotes from the IG report. 4 of them. So there's a lot to get to. To you, which one was the most information, the quote unquote bombshell of what they released on Friday?
Well, I think their information was important because it demonstrated that there is now conclusive evidence, if anybody really needed it, that the FBI was engaged in not only selling disinformation, but knowingly selling disinformation to the FISA courts. Those 4 footnotes are very important, and that's why they were kept classified, and the reason is they were classified because they implicate foreign governments, probably the United Kingdom more than any one, and also very sensitive Russian intelligence sources that the CIA is aware of. But more important than the footnotes is, excuse me for jumping ahead here, but the headline today is, Bill Barr announced that there are going to be indictments in this case. Mm-hmm. When he went on the Laura Ingraham show the other night and gave an amazing interview for an attorney general of the United States, he said, yeah, sure, John Durham could write a report, but that's not what he's doing. He's getting ready to bring indictments if he has the evidence, quote unquote. But the if he has the evidence is like a passé footnote. What the Attorney General was saying after saying that Crossfire Hurricane was one of the greatest travesties in American history, and that he's deeply disturbed about what the evidence that he has seen, I think it's pretty clear that John Brennan, if he doesn't have a lawyer now, then he better get one, because the indictments are coming. As we have discussed on this program for a long time, this was never about John Durham writing a report. He can do that if he wants to, but the most important thing is to bring indictments. And the Attorney General just said to us, that's exactly what he's doing. So for folks who missed it, the footnotes are great, but they're nothing compared to what Bill Barr said about John Durham.
Well, I'd like to wind back to asking you more about the footnotes in a second, but since you brought up Bill Barr, I want to play a piece of audio for you. And this is, as you mentioned, an intensity and a severity that I have not heard Bill Barr use yet. And Bill Barr's a plain-spoken guy, but this particular cut 15, shows that he unequivocally has assessed, along with John Durham, that there was no mistake here when it came to going after President Trump. Listen to this.
I think what happened to him was one of the greatest travesties in American history. Without any basis, they started this investigation of his campaign, and even more concerning, actually, is what happened after the campaign, the whole pattern of events while he was president. To sabotage the presidency, and I think that, or at least had the effect of sabotaging the presidency.
In other words, the greatest travesties in American history is opening this without basis, this investigation, while he was a candidate, and then what's even worse, sabotaging the presidency.
Yes, this has been the obvious truth to anyone who would assess the available public evidence from day one. What Bill Barr said, and make no mistake about it, he is getting regular briefings from John Durham, who we now know is working out of a federal grand jury in D.C., that he has issued a large number of subpoenas, that he has interviewed CIA intel officers, that he has interviewed people from the Director of National Intelligence who were involved in generating the intelligence assessment at the end of the Obama administration, which was a false document created by John Brennan. This is pretty stunning stuff coming from an attorney general. I personally am pleased to hear it because it was very important for the American public to begin to get their arms wrapped around the fact that there's going to be some pretty ugly stuff happening against former U.S. government officials who violated federal law. And it's pretty clear that what John Durham is pursuing is a massive conspiracy to deny the civil rights of American citizens and to corrupt the intelligence apparatus of the United States government through fraud and dissembling. That's where he's headed.
Joe, you said that he's not going to be doing a report, that he's, getting lawyers together. You talked about a D.C. grand jury, but we've heard in the past that the reason that they didn't go after some people, the reason they didn't immediately, press charges, and they've said it was because they couldn't get an indictment. Because in D.C., in the district, it's very hard to get an indictment against a Democrat politician. So how is he going to do that? Are we just not, if you're talking about Democrat politicians, names that people recognize in the district, isn't it going to be close to impossible to get any kind of indictment?
No, I don't think so. I think in the cases where there have been no indictments sought or attempted, there's only one case where we know that there might have been a refusal by a grand jury, and that's in the Andrew McCabe case. And we don't even know if that's true. We do know that you can get an indictment. I don't have any doubt that John Durham's going to be able to get indictments. The bigger issue would be whether or not he can get a conviction. I'm not worried about that. This is not about convicting people. It's about charging them, knowing you have guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and then letting a jury make up its mind. What's important here is disclosure, transparency, exposure, making the indictments, having them be fully backed up by evidence, and I have no doubt whatsoever that those indictments are coming now. Bill Barr would have never given that interview, would have never said what he said about the severity of the conduct of Brennan and Clapper and Comey and McCabe and even White House officials and senior intelligence officials. I think this is, and who knows when it's going to happen. I mean, they say it could be the late summer. That's pretty close to an election, but I don't think it's going to stop them. They're not going to hold up indictments because of an election.
Do you have a suspicion about the nature of the charges that would be filed against a guy like John Brennan?
Yes, conspiracy to deny the civil rights of American citizens through the providing of false information to U.S. intelligence and law enforcement sources for the purpose of instigating an improperly based investigation in the United States. I have no doubt that John Brennan conspired with officials overseas who were either witting or unwitting of what he was doing. For example, there is no doubt that the FBI, in conjunction with former assets of the CIA, planted purposely false information with U.S. persons overseas in order to get that information to come back into the United States, pretend that it was real intelligence, and then use that information to get FISA warrants. The FISA warrants that were obtained against Carter Page are part of the conspiracy because they were not founded on legitimate information. And we now know from the footnotes in the Grassley-Johnson letter that the FBI and the CIA purposely ignored exculpatory information against all of the targets in those warrants and allowed the warrants to go forward. The submission of those applications for FISA warrants under those circumstances is A, crime, and B, it is what is called an overt act in a large criminal conspiracy.
Okay, hold tight, Joe. We want to ask you more about this in just a second. We have a lot to ask, and I know you've got a lot to say.
We're here with Joe diGenova, and we're discussing the report that was put out by Senators Chuck Grassley and Ron Johnson. These disclosures, they disclosed 4 redacted footnotes in the IG report. And also discussing, you're just joining us about the Attorney General William Barr going on some of the talk shows this weekend and saying, hey, people are going to be held accountable here, and what happened was egregious. You had mentioned foreign governments, Joan. We know that there were, I think, 4 pages that were held back by the Trump administration, that were not released and made public because of the theory that they do involve foreign governments. Will we now see those 4 pages? Will we now see what's involved in that and the governments that may be involved in this and exactly what they did?
Yes, and there's no choice now. Since Durham is going to bring indictments, the defendants are going to be able to seek classified information as part of their defense. And in order to short-circuit that, these governments will be mentioned directly in the charging documents, and if they're not mentioned directly, they will be described in such a way that you will have no trouble identifying the UK, Australia, Italy, and maybe one other country. This is pretty staggering stuff. It is clear that they are holding back certain declassifications because of the pending indictments that Durham is working on. That makes eminently good sense at this point, because you don't want people to know what you know when you're conducting an investigation. And something else has happened. I don't know if you saw the op-ed piece by Ron Johnson in the Wall Street Journal on Friday. It's staggering. It is must reading for anybody who cares about this case. But there is a sentence in it in which he asks one of several important questions. Listen to this question. Why did former FBI Director James Comey and former FBI General Counsel James Baker refuse to have their security clearances reinstated before they were interviewed by the Inspector General? Was it so they wouldn't have to explain the provision of disinformation to the courts? That is another overt act in this criminal conspiracy. In other words, John Durham will be able to charge that as part of the criminal conspiracy, Comey and Baker did not get classified clearances reinstated, so they wouldn't have to answer questions of the Inspector General. This is getting very big, very fast.
It's amazing. You know, when we were talking about this earlier this morning, Joe, one of the things that is abundantly clear is that this information was in the control of the FBI for so long now, for years, that
Yes.
they were confident that this was Russian disinformation, and never once during what seemed to be hundreds of leaks about this case did that information ever come out. These were always leaks designed to hurt the president, to create a swirl of scandal around President Trump, and instead, as the truth bears out, and as we're finally getting to see everything that the FBI knew through all of that time, it constantly bears out in the president's favor.
And not only is that true, it is absolutely true, every single word that you just said. But here's what's worse. This is still happening under FBI Director Chris Wray, one of the worst FBI directors in the history of the Justice Department. That this type of dissembling and deceit and deception could happen this far into the Trump presidency with a new FBI director who is supposed to be cleaning house, which he is not. This is disgusting. And as I've said on this show and other shows repeatedly, Christopher Wray is an embarrassment to the FBI. Everybody in that building hates to go there every day knowing that he sits on the 7th floor with his entourage of people encircling him to protect the people who did things wrong. And I'm going to say this one more time. You have never heard him give the speech condemning his predecessors, and you never will, because he's an apparatchik. In the truest sense of the old Communist Party word, he's an apparatchik. He's there to serve a purpose, and it's not to protect federal law enforcement. It's to protect his predecessors.
So are you saying, though, that he knew what was going on?
Yes, absolutely. Christopher Wray knew all of this from the very beginning. Remember, you and I are learning about some of this stuff for the first time. They knew about this stuff 3 years ago. And believe me, the first thing that happened to this dunce when he became the FBI director was they gave him a briefing. And if he has half a brain, which he probably has at least half a brain, he knows exactly what's going on. He's surrounded by some very smart people, Dana Buente, all these guys who've hung on from the Bush administration. They've done nothing to improve the goodness or the efficiency of government, but they've done a great job of protecting their predecessors. And you know who was at the head of this bunch? Rod Rosenstein. There's an old name from the past, the guy who's done more damage to this president than anybody else other than John Brennan.
Well, Joe, thank you so much. We have so much. I wrote down a whole bunch of questions to ask you as you were speaking. I'm taking notes.
Yeah.
But there's a lot. So I don't think this is the last time we're going to have this conversation. But I will tell you, Joe, if people do not go to jail, I'm going to hunt you down because you keep getting my hopes up, and then they are dashed against the rocks of my dreams. Okay, so I just want you to know I'm going to hold you to this.
Rely on Barr.
Yes,
all right. Thank you so much, Joe. Have a great week.
I got to say, if coronavirus dies in heat, Joe diGenova just wiped it out in Washington. He's breathing so much fire, that guy. Thank you, Joe.
Adios.